welcome to Cafe CSE. For those of you who are first-timers, this is an event that is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Europe here at BYU to bring together experts in fields having to do with Europe and to help you engage in a discussion with those individuals. So we're looking forward to a lively session today. The Center for the Study of Europe is primarily funded via a grant from the Department of Education. And we have the mandate to be a resource center here in this geographical area to help spread the learning of European language and culture and history and so on. So my name is Martha Peacock, and I am the acting director for the Center for the Study of Europe for this year. The Center for the Study of Europe here at BYU is celebrating its 10th year anniversary this year, so it's a big year for us. And all of the Cafe C presentations are part of that celebration year. So we are having a contest and lots of giveaways and lots of events and activities this year. It started out with our Europe in a Nutshell conference earlier on, which was this tremendous success, and will continue on throughout the year with various types of events. And so in relationship to that, we are giving away gift certificates, airfares, other great prizes. And all you have to do to win this is pay attention to the instructions up here on the screen, which is to take out your phones and text Europe and your name and your email address. And then at each event, including tonight, we will announce the winner of that particular contest for that evening. And so if you will quickly do that before the screen goes off here, and so that you can get entered for that contest. Now, in addition to us giving away a $50 certificate tonight, which you have to be here to receive, so stay till the end, you will also be automatically entered into Europe airfare giveaway at the end of the year. So we will announce that. So some great prizes. So you'll want to pay attention to that. This Cafe CSE is being recorded by BYU Radio, and it will be broadcast tomorrow. And you can find this then by going online at byuradio.org. So we encourage you to listen to it and encourage your friends to listen to it as well. We are sending around 2 sign-in sheets that are making the rounds of the room here, and we would love to hear from you in terms of your information, and we will contact you about further events, further things having to do with our celebration of our 10-year anniversary. And it also helps us in our reporting to the Department of Education of the broad audience that our activities are reaching. So we'd really appreciate it if you would sign into those things today. Okay, if we can have our first image up here. I thought about my own introduction to European cinema, and the first real interesting film that I can remember watching that was a foreign film was Babette's Feast, which I'm sure lots of you have seen. It's been here to international cinema, I know, a number of times. But it was an incredible film. It's a film about a woman who has come as an outsider to this small town. It's a Danish film, and she comes as a servant to these 2 older women who are daughters of a Protestant minister, and they're basically carrying on with his legacy, this very severe Lutheran kind of culture. And she comes and decides that she's going to put on this magnificent feast for the women whom she works for, but also a number of neighbors. And all I remember about this film, it was just the preparing of food. She's just constantly making food throughout the film and gathering out. She spends all of her money, basically, to prepare this tremendous feast for these women. And you just see course after course coming out and being served to these individuals. It's this interesting metaphorical film that has Christian sort of overtones, with Babette Brett sort of acting as this Christ-like figure who sacrifices herself, gives all that she has in service then to these older people from the village. And while we don't have quite those same sort of religious connections for tonight's feast, we have a feast out there that Brenda has laid out for us. And so I'm hoping that you will stay for the reception afterwards because it looks glorious. We're so grateful that Brenda is part of our office, part of our team, because she does a marvelous job. So that brings us to the logistics of today's presentation. First of all, we will listen to our two participants here as they discuss European film in a global kind of context. And then they're going to talk for about a half an hour. During this time, we'd like you to think about questions that you have or comments that you would like to make in relationship to what they're discussing, because at about 25 or 22, we will open it up to the floor for questions, and we would like you to line up over here on this side of the room where we have a microphone, and so that you can be heard by everybody as well as by the radio broadcast. So we would invite you to be thinking about those questions that you're going to ask. Then we will end that session of question and answer by 5 o'clock. So if you're worried about getting to another class or an appointment or so on, know that we will be done by 5 o'clock. And then after that, we will announce the winner of the Visa gift card for $50. And then we will have a reception out here, and it's going to be marvelous. So I hope you'll stay for that. And you can, during that time, engage in further discussion with our two panelists here. And so we hope that you will stick around. All right, for our presenters today, we are really lucky to have people who very much are engaged in scholarship on European film. First of all, here closest to me is Bob Hudson, who's from the French and Italian department. Bob is an assistant professor here at BYU, and he deals a lot with devotional and pastoral verse in the 16th century, and in fact has a book that he's working on currently called The Ghost of Moreau. But he's also very much interested in French and Italian film studies. He has a couple of articles out, first of all on Robert Bresson's film, and then also on Jean-Pierre Melville's films, which I found out was a pseudonym, so Bob may talk more about that today. So we're grateful to have his expertise. And then our second member of the panel here is Chip Oscarson, who, by the way, is our current acting director for the Center of the Study of Europe.
Associate director.
Oh, is he? Sorry, associate director. Oh, Chip, you said that. Okay, sorry. I don't know. Who knows these titles? Okay, associate director. Yeah. Okay, thanks for correcting me.
I don't want your job.
All right. He is, I don't know, Wade kept giving me various titles, so I have no idea. Anyway, he works really hard for us, so we're really grateful for that. He is part of the Department of Humanities, Classics, and Comparative Literature, is an assistant professor there. And he truly has a number of interests in film. Scandinavian film, and interestingly, its connection to the environment, and so that's an interesting connection, which he'll probably talk more to us about. He has a really interesting article here called "From the Fairgrounds to the Salon: Cinema and the Rise of Mass Visual Culture in Nordic Literary History." So, I mean, he's got some really interesting things. I won't even attempt to pronounce the names of some of the cinematic titles that he has published, but I'm sure he'll tell us a lot more about that. So we are really grateful for their time and preparation in coming here this afternoon, and we will turn the time over to them. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Martha. Well, we very much wanted to do this as a discussion today, and kind of have a discussion in front of you. So, forgive kind of the rough edges. We thought that what we gained in its kind of in the extemporaneous nature kind of made up for maybe some of the the rough edges that we're not going to necessarily move systematically through an argument here today. But what we wanted to do is to talk a little bit in front of you and share kind of our own ideas and hear questions from you, of course, about some of these, the basic categories that we use to think about film. And this could be true of any kind of art. It's not necessarily unique to film. But this idea that we use different kinds of kind of categories and boxes to help us organize and think through what it is that we're engaging and experiencing. And one of the major categories that's been particularly applied to film in the last 100 years of cinema has been this question of nationality. And so we wanted to think through a little bit, what's the relevance of the category? When we think about nations, what are we talking about? Why do we talk about this? And what kind of cultural work does this do? There's a lot of other categories that we could have picked as well, and we're going to touch on some of these other ones today, the idea of auteurs, for example. And why do we want to think of films as being kind of made by auteurs? Again, what does that do? How does that direct our interpretation of these films? And also, as a cultural phenomenon, why do we choose the particular categories that we do? Because maybe that says something about our own historical moment or the historical moments that that brought these to life. So yeah, so that's kind of the general kind of sketch of what we wanted to do. And Bob, give us a quick kind of background. Why do we like to think of nations when we're talking about cinema?
Well, even the idea of dividing knowledge and compartmentalizing knowledge, it's really our inheritance from Aristotle, right? Despite the Renaissance, despite the Enlightenment, there's still this Aristotelian penchant to scholastically divide things. And it's problematic, much like the notion of the nation itself, in that when you draw borders, what defines these borders? What makes a nation? It's a big question that has been very important in the 20th century and is important today, especially in an age of globalization. But why a nation? What are some of the categories? What makes a French film? What makes a Swedish film? What makes a Danish film? You showed Babette's Feast, which is a Danish film, but it's in French. What makes that what it is? So is it language? Is it because the film is in a given language that it's going to be a French film, Italian film, Swedish film? Is it the nationality of the director? Is it the source of funding? Who's paying the bills for this film? The location of the studio, it could be as simple as that, but that's problematic. The intended audience, I think that's an important one too. Where is this film going to be shown? But the idea of nationality in cinema is really it's a more recent phenomenon than cinema itself. When cinema started off, it was technological advancement. It was, we want to take what Edison has in the box and project it onto a larger screen for a large audience. And it's really at war. It's at moments of war that this nationalism really comes out. Narrative cinema?
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned this kind of the early moments of cinema, and I mean, it strikes me that one of the discourses that really surrounds early cinema is how it's this international medium, right? And this is especially true before you get to narrative films around, the kind of feature-length narrative films around 1910, 1911. It's actually the Danes that developed this as a genre, right? And that's when it gets a little bit more talk-heavy. The intertitles become a little bit more important. But one of the things that really strikes some of the early, the early theorists of film, or maybe that overstates what they were, the kind of the commentators on film, is this is an international medium. It doesn't belong to any kind of nation. It's not restricted to language, right? It was about kind of gesture and action and suggestion, from the visual image. And so it had this kind of national transparency, at least initially, right?
Well, the intertitles themselves. I mean, it was how you think that the intertitles are going to be in a given language, but how difficult is it just to go in and splice in
it's really
your
easy
own language
when you
intertitles?
have this,
And you're right, it's all gesticulation, it's all gesturing.
So if this is how it started off, then what is it that gets us to? I mean, you say moments of war. I presume you're thinking of the First World War. What is it that changes this dynamic to where, where a film is made is more important?
I think you hit the nail on the head with narrative cinema. It's when you're telling a story, what story are you telling, right? Cabiria in Italy, it's the Second Punic War. It's this epic silent film masterpiece, but they're definitely telling a story of the noble Roman versus the savage other. So it's this us and othering. Even the first narrative film, A Trip to the Moon, is very French in that it's very nationalistic. They're waving the tricolore. They're playing, there were notes included by Méliès himself to play the Marseillaise at certain times, and they're waving the flag. They were the first one to make the trip to the moon before anybody had ever really made it to the moon.
Okay, well, I'll give you a counter example though that's kind of interesting in this regard. Then you take the Danes, and so Danish cinema before World War I was the second biggest film industry in Europe, right after the French. Which it's kind of remarkable, right? Little tiny Denmark. I mean, there's hardly any domestic market for it, and in part because of the fact that you couldn't market your film. Nordiska Studio, which is the big studio in Copenhagen, they couldn't rely on Danes supporting their films, right? The budgets kind of exceeded what the domestic market could do, and their strategy was to sell to Germany. And in fact, these companies were. They not only made the films, but they owned the distribution chains and they owned the venues. So with these kind of vertically integrated companies, and it was a great model. And there was no German film industry; there was Danish, but it meant that precisely that it couldn't be national, right? And so whereas you might get that with the Méliès, you would never get that in a Danish film. It's always this, not specific. Urban milieu, similar kinds of storylines, usually these kind of erotic melodramas, something about class, but never with any kind of cultural specificity. I mean, European, yes, but never any cultural specificity. And this would have been, maybe kind of a counterexample to what you're talking about then, coming out of
Méliès I think Méliès is an example apart from the other ones, but Cabiria very much in the first rumors of a First World War, this idea of following Risorgimento in Italy, and this idea of a founding nationalism. Have Mussolini that's already on the scene in the newspapers and this kind of thing. But also in America, we have it especially around World War I, or just after World War I. In France, you'd have Abel Gance, Napoleon, where it's this, this triptych filmed in blue, white, and red, and it's glorifying France through Napoleon. Or even D.W. Griffith in Birth of a Nation. I mean, you even get nation in the title. We are definitely in a nationalistic age after World War I, and you start making national cinema where both conventions and elements of story are culturally marked. And
what are some of the things you're thinking about, and what marks a French film, kind of post-war?
After World War I?
Yeah.
A focus, it's actually better probably after World War II, but we'll look at World War I II. There's this focus on French daily life. That's one thing the French do well, is a focus on daily life. When I think some of the best French cinema, and I'm extending this all the way to the French New Wave, is this focus on rituals of daily life, how you live your life. And the fact that the brand marketing, even product placement, we've got our Perrier
Yeah,
here.
that's right.
Globalization, we've got Perrier that's distributed by Nestle, which is a Swiss company from North America and Stamford, Connecticut. I mean, we're in the global age, clearly, but you had product placement. Even very early on, you had not just product placement in the sense of go out and buy this, but you're also buying a lifestyle and a way of life. And the French were very conscientious of showing a lifestyle through their film.
I wonder, though, if it's not just, I mean, the war, yes, but maybe it's more indirect than just this kind of question of rising nationalism, which unquestionably is part of it, right? I mean, this is actually what led to the downfall of the Danish film industries. The Germans decided that we don't want Danes making our product, right? And because they weren't importing as much from France and the United States during the war, they had, this is when UFA is formed, the big national film company. But it's precisely, too, Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned Griffith, because you can talk about this as an American kind of, it's marking, there's a patriotism that's kind of being, it's a complicated patriotism perhaps in Birth of America, but with really overt kind of racism, of course, and things like this. But we usually don't talk about American cinema, do we? We talk about Hollywood cinema. What's the difference? Why is it Hollywood? I mean, I think it's linked to this question of the World War, right? That this is when Hollywood grabs market share in Europe, and that it's never relinquished, right? When everyone else is busy, with the war, it's the Americans and the Swedes to a lesser degree, that are standing outside the war for a big part of it that flood the market, right?
Well, the whole backstory of Edison and the invention of Hollywood is very interesting, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. But the fact that you did have it was in New York, but New York was too close to Edison, and Edison was trying to stamp out any competitors. And it's actually Edison that chased. He had goon squads that would chase Lumiere cameramen out of New York City, and he actually chased them west. They went to Chicago, and then Chicago, of course, exploded in the 20s, and they chased them to Hollywood. And they showed up in Hollywood, and they're like, wow, we're here in Los Angeles. There's all this area to develop. If I want the ocean in my shot, I can go to the ocean. If I want the desert, I've got the desert. If I want mountains, I've got mountains. All within an hour's drive with your film crews. So Hollywood was actually it showed up at just the right time after the war to really take over.
Yeah.
And you're right that we don't talk about American film that much. We don't talk about an American filmmaker. I mean, you have New York filmmakers like Woody Allen, or even we could talk about Scorsese as being a New York filmmaker. But when you think about American film, it's Hollywood.
Yeah.
And by and large, I think European film is budding up. Auteur cinema is budding up against this idea of what Hollywood's doing and then what we do differently.
Yeah, so this points us in an interesting direction then when we're trying to think about nationalism, kind of what it is. A lot of times nationalism presents itself as a kind of essence, right? That there's some kind of core something that isn't constructed, it just simply is, right? I mean, that's the way it has to present itself that way, otherwise it loses its authenticity. But the fact of Hollywood kind of cinema suggests to us that maybe nationalism is always, by its very nature, defined in opposition to something else.
Has to be, yeah.
Right? And so Hollywood becomes this kind of monolithic category, kind of within film, and you can distinguish your own product by kind of reacting against it, right? By trying to make some kinds of assertions that it's somehow different, and then some of these national categories, which are clearly at work in the political sphere and in other dimensions of of life, that's ready to hand, right? That these are the first things you pick up.
Absolutely, and I think this idea of styles and conventions really becomes clear in Hollywood that uses a studio system as opposed to an auteur or director system. Films in the golden age, so 30s, 40s, and 50s, you're not looking at directors, this is a Paramount picture, this is an RKO film, this is a Warner Brothers or MGM film. Mm-hmm. Who can tell me who the director of The Wizard of Oz was? Anybody know? Yeah, it's an MGM. It's Victor Fleming. Victor Fleming directed it. It had a director, but we only know it by the studio that produced it. And in Europe, it's very different. You had in France, you had Jean Renoir. You had I'm drawing a blank here. Fritz Lang. Mm-hmm. In Germany, you had all these great directors that were auteurs, that were artists, that took control and made films. Whereas you didn't have that. You had the studio that decided what our aesthetic is, what our message is, how we're going to film things, what kind of cinematography we're going to use. They had to approve scripts. Where you had people like Renoir, that was really the Dieu, the Almighty God of his studio, of his production. So I think that's a big difference, is who's making the film and whose artistic vision are we getting? Are we getting United Artists' artistic vision? Are we getting Marcel Carné's artistic vision? Are we getting Fritz Lang's artistic vision? Are we getting Rossellini's artistic vision? So I think that's a big difference.
Okay, well, and that adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing, right? So instead of just being able to talk about French film, you've kind of introduced this other kind of concept of the auteur, which becomes important, especially kind of mid-century, right? That's when that really gets
after
articulated.
Another war.
After another war, yeah, sure, right? But it's a way of trying to. But my point being that with this other layer, again, this complicates the necessity, I guess, of the idea of the nation, right? Mm-hmm. Is it a French film or is it a Renoir film, right? Now, it could be both at the same time, but in what ways is is artistic vision, by an individual, right, that has to kind of see it, it has to manifest itself in some kind of way. I mean, this is every bit as arbitrary as the idea of nationality, right?
Right, and it really problematizes the thing also because, if it's a French film, if Renoir is a French filmmaker or Rossellini is an Italian French maker, there's this idea in pigeonholing them, this Aristotelian idea of categorizing them as Italian, as French, as German as whatever else, that there's this assumption that they're only influenced by film in their own tradition. You know, these filmmakers are making films, but they're also watching films. They're doing each other's work. Rossellini himself started off working on the set with Renoir. So you know, there's a sharing. So you know, whose artistic vision is it? Can we stamp it as belonging to this nation? Does it conform to a certain nation, or is it something else?
Okay, so why do we need that category then? What is it that's creating the need for auteurs? I mean, we can talk about that. Yeah, there are these people doing these films, but on the other hand, it's fulfilling, you know, some kind of cultural need that we want to see artists in cinema at this point. And why is that?
We want to talk about France as a particular case, because that's where auteur is a French term, coined by Truffaut, and this great essay he wrote. You can find it on the internet. It's worth looking up. On a certain tendency in French cinema, 1954. So following World War II, France found itself again bankrupt, major problems. Of course, you know, the Allies won the war, but France suffered greatly, having part of the war fought on its own soil. And also, you had this idea of how do we revive French cinema? How do we revive French culture? So there was the COIC, which was a committee that turned into the National Cinematic Committee, the CNC, in France. There was the Bloomberg's Accord, where there was an agreement between Léon Blum and the French government and Bern. I forget his first name, but he was an American senator, of how many American films could be shown in France, how much of the product had to be actually French. This also controlled how many French songs, there was a ratio between French songs to American songs that could be played on the radio. So this idea of, we're the French, we're proud, we were beaten down pretty badly by 2 world wars, but we still have this French national pride. So they started making what they would call the tradition de qualité, the tradition of quality cinema. And what they were doing was they were making big budget films in the late 40s, early 50s that were based on Hollywood models, with the studio-driven, big budget, and they would look back to French masterpieces like The Red and the Black. The Stendhal novel was made into a film. There's various other ones like this, and they adopted an American model and really lost the Frenchness of the auteur tradition. And what Truffaut came in and wrote was the certain tendency was this looking to the past, and he called it cinéma de papa, so granddad cinema. You're looking at granddad cinema. He's almost mocking the golden age. And he said, you know, what we do well in France is being auteur, and it's not just France. He said, yeah, we have Renoir, we have Carnet, but there's also Rossellini, who is a great author. The Americans, and you go, an American filmmaker that isn't quite necessarily a Hollywood filmmaker. I think the great American auteur would be Orson Welles. They're looking at Welles, they're looking at Italian neorealism, they're looking at Hitchcock as these great auteurs, authors of their works, artists. And what Truffaut suggests is that we emulate these filmmakers who are actually making, or who are taking their pen, their camera, wielding it like a pen, and writing their own novels through film. So there's very much the poinçon, the trademark in each film that belongs to an auteur.
Yeah, I mean, this is really problematic because, of course, okay, so Hitchcock is directing the film, but how big is the crew that's working on it, right? I mean, this is the same in, you take one of the quintessential European auteurs too, right? Comes from Scandinavia, Ingmar Bergman, and it's the exact same kind of thing, right? It's a Bergman film, we use this kind of category, and yet Sven Nykvist, his cinematographer, is every bit as responsible for the image that that we get as Bergman himself, right? The actors and the actresses, the people doing the lighting, right? I mean, it's kind of goes down the line, but it seems like it's especially kind of post World War II, there's this there's the desire to kind of get into more challenging types of art forms. That might be part of it, right? That there's been this kind of experience that maybe the ways that we've told stories to each other is, doesn't seem sufficient for accounting for the experience that we collectively have had. That might be part of it. But as well, it's this kind of again fighting back the onslaught of Hollywood, the onslaught of American culture, which is identified with the studio tradition. This kind of assembly line kind of mentality. We want to believe, whether it's true or not, that they're this kind of very romantic notion of the artist, right? That the artist is kind of inspired in this perhaps almost mystical sort of way, right? And is able to see his or her, although it was usually his, kind of vision, onto the screen, despite, the odds of the studio that wants to kind of suppress this, this voice and things like that. But like with all these categories, I think we maybe miss something in looking only at the question of auteurs with these things. And you point to some really interesting aspects of how so much of what actually ends up on the screen is determined by the ability to get financing, where that money's coming from policies that the government has in place about how much product has to be French versus American versus something else. I mean, it's interesting because if to again return to the area that one of the areas I'm most familiar with, Scandinavia, they make some really interesting decisions in various parts of Scandinavia dealing with production, in that. For the Norwegians, they saw film as a kind of a money-making proposition, and so they have individual cities would actually own the theaters and just keep the profits and turn them into roads and sewers and whatever else they needed. In Sweden, they followed a little bit different model where a certain amount of the proceeds went back into a film fund that was administered by the government, right? That would kind of give out funding for making of Swedish film. And so even if you went to see a Hollywood film, it would still fund Swedish film, right? And not surprisingly, Sweden continues to have a really vibrant kind of film tradition that Norway never had. So I guess one of the reasons why we continue to talk about nationality with film, even though we've kind of pointed to some of the reasons that yes, the idea of a nation is a construct, right? Geographical borders are artificial; they change over time. Notions of ethnicity aren't even constant, right? That they are open to kind of redefinition, constantly. Language isn't necessarily a good indicator either of what a nation is or isn't. Belgium is is a great kind of example of this. That even though there are all these ways that it seems inadequate, if we simply look at kind of the way films are actually made, maybe that points to a direction of why this is still an important category, right? That sometimes the funding comes from sources that are invested in the idea of a nation and kind of maintaining the idea of a nation.
And there's others that fight against that also. I mean, it's interesting you bring up Belgium. My favorite filmmakers right now are the Dardenne brothers, and they make Belgian films with Belgian themes and showing the Belgian way, a gritty slice of the Belgian way of life, but they're funded by French sources or European sources. So Belgium as this divided identity, but also as the seat of the European Union is very interesting. They just recently, I think in 2008, started the Prix Lux, the Lux Prize, again based on the idea of lux, the Latin for light. But it's the award for the best achievement in European filmmaking. So I wonder right now, maybe we can, with the time that we have left, talk about, is it proper to speak of European cinema? Can we just see it as pan-European? I mean, so many of the great filmmakers right now are not limiting themselves. I mean, the vision of Truffaut, as you very aptly pointed out, is very conservative and idealistic and mystic. And I think we've more embraced this idea that our cinematic output is less identified with one nation, but identified more with Europe, in Europe right now.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit skeptical when I hear kind of talk of European cinema because it sounds like a project coming from Brussels. You know what I mean? It sounds like some kind of funded thing because there's their vested interest in building up an idea of Europe, right? And so I guess out of the one side of my mouth, I talk about, we're so postmodern, right, that we can kind of get by the idea of nation. But then when I kind of look, at this kind of bald-faced attempt, okay, let's create an identity artificially then, perhaps. I then say, oh, I'm skeptical of that kind of, project. It seems, I don't know.
When it's mandated, I think it's problematic. Yeah, I mean, I think when it's mandated, but you look at the two films that we have, the two films that we've selected for the international cinema this week with Copie Conforme Certified Copy, which is a film made by an Iranian Persian filmmaker, starring a British opera singer in his first film, and Juliette Binoche, an established leading lady in France. Filmed in Tuscany, and they switch very easily between French, Italian, and English throughout the film. So you have this idea.
Well, I love how different characters speak different languages. It's not just that he speaks always English and she speaks French, right? They're both in and out of these languages all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and it really, the film, one of the reasons we talked about doing this is that the film problematizes the question of authenticity in a really great way. And this is the problem with nationality too, right? A lot of times we fall back on it as a category that's supposed to somehow guarantee authenticity, and that's really problematic. And yet what the film also points to is the fact that a copy has its own value, right? That a copy does its own work as well, and it doesn't necessarily have to rely on the question of authenticity. And so that points us to the idea, I think, that the idea of nationality in cinema, we don't have to believe in nationality as an essence. We can understand the ways that it's being constructed all of the time as a cultural artifact, and yet still see it as having some kind of value and use to us, right? We continue, for example, to teach French and Italian cinema class, or the German and Scandinavian, cinema class, or Spanish cinema, or we have these classes in the curriculum. Why do we keep doing them if we're saying that the category is passé in some ways?
Right, and it's useful. I mean, it's still very useful. In academia, we have to break it down. I can't, I couldn't just teach a course on, I guess I could, on just cinema, but then what choice of films? You have to narrow it down. There has to be a narrowing down. But even in that process, it's a difficult process. Can I show Copie Conforme in my French cinema class? It's, by an Iranian author. Can I show Michael Radford's Il Postino, The Postman, a British filmmaker that uses a French actor in Philippe Noiret to play a Chilean poet who is in Italy with an Italian cast. So you have all this. It's very global. Yeah. Am I justified in doing that? That's the question I have to ask myself.
Well, what strikes me is that you could just as well justify showing Le Havre in your French and Italian cinema class as I could show it in my German and Scandinavian cinema class, right? And that it's made by Aki Kaurismäki, with Finnish director. Finnish money. I mean, the money for this film comes from literally all over Europe, right? He has some Finnish actors, French actors, African actors. It's and it thematizes precisely the problem with thinking that in a way has always been the problem with thinking of national terms, but maybe was somewhat obscured in that. He uses the city, the port of Le Havre as this nexus point where the world is coming together. It's this, it's about moving through this place. And Kaurismäki, does this so well in other films. Also, A Man Without a Past, which is one of my favorite Scandinavian films, is likewise set in a harbor, Helsinki harbor, and it's about the margins of society, and it's this transitory space, things moving through it, and things that don't seem to belong in Finland, right? American music, for example, or you take Le Havre, you see the influence from kind of the French New Wave, on what he's doing. I mean, the way he uses colors and things like this, it's kind of a blowback to the 60s, and so you have a Finnish director who himself is influenced from all over the world. Borders don't kind of keep these things out. This hit home to me. I went to a silent film festival in Italy a few years ago in Pordenone. It happens every year. They kind of bring out the most recent restorations. And I'd been, studying Scandinavian silent cinema, and kind of think of, Scandinavian silent cinema. And what really struck me was when I went here and we saw, there was a Danish film series, yes, but then there was also, they were showing a bunch of Griffith films. They always show, 1 year of Griffith's, works every year at this thing. And they, there was a German series going on, and a series that was more thematic, that wasn't based on nationality, and it was this kind of revelation that the people who went to see the films that I'm the Scandinavian films that I'm studying weren't just going to see Swedish film, right? They were seeing French film, they were seeing lots of American film, and there weren't these discrete audiences, right? It's always this kind of global phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think even American filmmakers aren't immune to it anymore. The fact that Martin Scorsese, Gangs of New York, you don't get much more New York than Gangs of New York, which was filmed in Cinecittà in Italy. So with a cast that was largely, in the same spirit of Sergio Leone, you just take the locals, and your extras are going to just be Italians that were wanting a day's wages, right?
Okay, the final question for you then, because I think we need to go to questions here. But here's a question for you to think. So if we want to think post nationally. What are some other kinds of, we'll think about it in terms of the curriculum, since we both teach film. What are some other categories of cinema that we could begin to think of? And this is especially relevant for something like the Center for the Study of Europe, that's invested in the notion of interdisciplinarity, right? Trying to think outside of the narrow boxes of kind of national literatures or films, and to thinking in different kind of combinations. What would some of these be, maybe?
One of the big ones could be war film. I mean, I think we've already seen the importance of war, the impact of war in the 20th century, which film was the 20th century medium for artistic medium. So for artistic expression, so films that deal with war, I think that's a very
so thinking kind of thematically.
Thematically, films about escape. You can have films even about films that directly discuss nationalism and nationality. It could be very interesting to do comparison. Like this idea of Le Havre, which is sort of like you mentioned Helsinki, and I don't know much about Helsinki, but I know that Le Havre is really this like non-lieu, right? It's a non-place in the sense that it's a port. It was destroyed during World War II. It was rebuilt. It doesn't have a whole lot of character, and you kind of when you're in Le Havre, you're usually leaving. You're coming, you're going. You're not established.
That's right.
So thematically would be one way, as you're saying.
I mean, thinking in terms of global cinema, right? Trying to trace the idea of global cinema could be really interesting.
Looking at documentaries, I mean, since we mentioned that most filmmakers are male, I think I will make a plug for a great female filmmaker, Agnès Varda, French New Wave, who's just fantastic and who really took the medium and stretched it in different directions. She has documentaries, but are they really documentaries? So it might be interesting to do a film with these filmmakers that really push the envelope, show these films that show, maybe have established a kind of chronology where filmmakers that really changed the medium in a very positive way.
It's kind of hard though, isn't it? Because it cuts against the way that we were educated a lot of times, right? That my background was in Scandinavian, so a lot of the films, that I saw, I was kind of trained in that tradition. It stretches me, as a scholar then, that I really have to, be open to, finding out a little bit more about, films made in different parts of the world that have this kind of important connection and are in this important kind of dialogue. With the films I already know.
We would love to thank these two presenters today for their lively discussion. I would encourage all of you who have questions to quickly line up here behind the microphone, not be shy. And while you're coming up, I just have a question that I wanted to talk to you about. Increasingly, political scientists, historians, art historians, which I am, are moving back nationalism as a term relating to cultures. To much earlier dates, even as far back as the 17th century and so on. Not because there are geographic borders that necessarily define it, or even necessarily language borders, but because there does seem to be an essence, a cultural essence that does define basically a group of people. So in this whole discussion, I kept thinking about Scandinavian film of the 20th century, and how it just always seems to me to have this character of coldness and soberness and austerity and a kind of darkness and so on, which I'm assuming comes mostly from the director. I don't know, there are obviously other things that come into play there. And I think about that in relationship to art history and how we teach Edvard Munch, for example, in that same sort of way of saying, but it is his experience, I mean, sort of like an Ibsen play, of living in a cold, dark environment that affects all of this. So are you basically saying that's not the case, that's all sort of relationships of Scandinavian film directors influencing one another, and it's not really even there, or what do you think?
Part of it is what films do we look at, right? So, I mean, to take your example of Edvard Munch, he's this kind of towering figure, and so he kind of, dominates, this period. But what if you, just didn't look at Munch, and you started to kind of look around with non-Munchian eyes, and suddenly you would kind of find all these other sorts of things. And this has been, a plug for, why do we need continual scholarship on any topic? And that is because we come with new questions today than what scholars in the early 20th century did, who really promoted Munch, right? I mean, Munch is worth still studying, don't get me wrong, but my point being that take a filmmaker like Georg af Klerker, for example, completely forgotten in the Swedish tradition because he didn't make films that were like the films that Bergman and others made later on. And it took kind of the work of both filmmakers and historians later on saying, wait a second, there's this really interesting silent filmmaker that we never see anymore, because we see these other, we tend to watch these other people because they tie into this tradition that has been come to established as Swedish, right? And so it requires, well, let's go back and revisit the Swedish tradition, and maybe the Swedish tradition looks something different. And if you're too invested in the idea of maintaining, we have to somehow maintain this category, then you're never going to see those kinds of things. That's the problem.
Are they just exceptions, or you're saying there's enough of them that we can't really talk about a Swedish film?
I think there are always exceptions. I mean, this is the problem with canon building, right? Is that anytime you come up with a definition, you are excluding something, you're privileging something and excluding something else, maybe for good reason. But you should be conscious of those reasons, and it's when they slip into the unconscious that's when I think nationality or any category loses its usefulness, is when it becomes unconscious.
Well, I will, if I can have just one thing to say to that also, the idea of essence and nationality and nationalism, this idea of who we are. It definitely comes up when I'm preparing a syllabus for French film, because there is this tendency towards sensuality and nudity, which is really part of the French experience, right? The Bon Gaulois is very corporal and carnal, and you get that in their film. So, I mean, again, canon building is always a problem, but I'd say that the French are much less prudish than any other nation when it comes to showing the nude body. So it is something that I have to deal with.
There are a few Scandinavians that might beg to differ, but
oh,
yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah.
I think it's on.
Yeah, it's on.
So considering the fact that the world looks a lot more like the map behind you and not next to me, do you see the future of cinema being more geographic-based, cultural-based than nation-based?
I think because of the way we're trained, because of Aristotle, as we mentioned from the start, and what we've been talking about, I think these are comfortable categories for us. These film courses, literature courses usually are housed, don't have to be, but usually are housed within language departments. So I don't see academia changing it very soon, but we do offer in European studies, there have been European film courses. I know that Dick Hacken organized, when I was a student here, series of films that were very interdisciplinary, that you were taking a theme and you showed films from different disciplines. So I don't know how quickly. Academia is not very quick to change. So I don't know how soon we're going to see a change in the way,
Well, but to plug, the Center for the Study of Europe and the Kennedy Center and some of these other things, I mean, these are precisely attempts to try and think differently. Right, and I think this is the general direction that the Academy is moving. But more broadly, I think we can apply your question, and that absolutely, I think that the whole idea of nation will continue to be eroded by the idea of globalism. I don't think it'll go away anytime soon. I think it'll have its relevance and its importance going forward. But I think that, think of things like the international English language film. Right? How do you categorize that, right? This is kind of interesting phenomenon where a film will be made in, say, Sweden, and it's made in English to find a broader audience. This is an interesting, these kinds of things, the world just gets more and more connected, and borders are more and more porous. And I think that'll be a trend that continues.
Well, that shift in category in the Oscars, it's not best foreign film anymore, it's best foreign language film. And then look at the films that have won Best Picture recently. Slumdog Millionaire, English, crew, Indian cast in English language, but it's not an American or Hollywood film, or is it? And then you have The King's Speech, last year's film, The Artist. Is The Artist a French film? It's got a French non-speaking
cast. They don't speak for crying out loud.
Azanavicius is a French filmmaker who doesn't have a very French name, but a French filmmaker. His wife is Bérénice Bejo. I think that's her name. She's half Argentine, half French. She doesn't have a spoken, Bérénice Bejo. She doesn't have a spoken part, but John Goodman's in it. It's Weinstein Money. Is it a French film? It won Best Picture.
It doesn't matter, right?
I mean,
does it matter?
But there are changes. We do see changes.
Yeah.
Who had the questions? Sorry.
Hey, my question, as far as I understand, film started for more documentary purposes, like with Edward Muybridge. But how soon did that change, or did it, or am I wrong in that? Did it change from more documentary purposes to artistic, and what spurred that change? Was it certain auteurs or directors that you're talking about, or was it just kind of natural from its conception?
Almost from the very beginning. Like you're right in that a lot of the first Lumiere films are what we could call kind of proto-document, the actualities, right? Showing workers leaving the factory, the train approaching the station. These are some of the iconic ones. But one of the first ones too is the I don't know how it's translated always, the waterer watered.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. This guy's watering, and this kid comes up and he kinks the hose, and the guy looks in it, and the guy the kid lets it go, and it sprays him in the face, right? And it's this kind of little trick gag sort of thing, but it's a basic narrative, and that's there almost from the beginning. And so that's 1895 is the first Lumiere film, the first public showing of cinema, and you have narrative films almost right away,
Yep.
and you get something that begins to look like real editing, of like piecing of stories together by turn of the century. So it happens very, very quickly that they see the potential. I mean, what's interesting is that you mentioned George Méliès. He is at one of the first showings of the Lumiere brothers, cinema, and he approaches them and wants to buy a license to be able to go and start, making films and showing films. And the Lumiere brothers, tell him, young man, don't waste your money. This is a flash in the pan. This is like so many of the other visual attractions. It's going to be gone, next year, kind of thing. And they were of course completely wrong. What he did is he went out and he invented his own.
One thing that Lumiere didn't get that Méliès did, and it seems so obvious, but the fact that they were limited to 50 seconds because they had 17 meters of celluloid to record on, whereas when Méliès did finally was able to get his own machine, his own cinematograph, he had the idea, why don't I splice things together? And it was in splicing together that you were able to make longer films and eventually build what we would call the feature-length film, that it wasn't just a 50-second vignette or 50-second documentary, but it was actually, you could tell a complex and complicated story.
Complex 5-minute story, right?
or 9 hour, if you're
So,
talking eventually.
Yeah.
So it seemed like you guys were hesitating to refer to films as being like European or like European cinema. But from a student perspective, a lot of my friends would like clump that together. European films as being more cerebral, right, than American films in general, and especially Hollywood films. And is that a generalization we shouldn't be making, or is there something to that? Is the funding different enough that actually more intelligent films can come from Europe, or is that something we've just sort of decided?
Oh, I think there is something.
Some of the really
to it.
dumb comedies never make it over.
Right. Yeah. Some of the really dumb.
A lot of the dumb comedies.
A lot of
never
the
make
dumb
it over.
comedies do make it, like Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis. I still don't get that film, but
Yeah.
anyway.
And it's interesting because those are some of the most culturally specific, aren't they?
It was the best. It was the #1 film in
the
10
#1
years
films, yeah.
since Amélie.
Yeah.
Well, but I think there is something to French. You could say European cinema being more cerebral. You also, a lot of times it's classified as art house cinema or as auteur cinema, and I think these in common American parlance, these are interchangeable. These are synonymous with each other.
But also a product of a very specific historical moment. I mean, auteur cinema and the art house movement, which are really linked, are more than anything else the product of the GI Bill after World War II. You had this huge number of people who were going to college for the very first time, like first in their family going to college after the Second World War. They were wearing black turtlenecks and berets, sitting around wanting to think deep thoughts. And Europeans, right, this was a new market that the Europeans were more than glad to fill because Hollywood, that wasn't their orientation at the time. What I would say, the idea of European film doesn't, I mean, you take certified copy, I mean, even that pushes the definition. Is it European? Is it, I mean, the category just seems almost useless in a sense to me. I think that something that we might think of as a category that would be helpful is what about independent film versus studio film, right? In some ways, that communicates more to us today, or at least it maybe did. I don't know. Already it's so blurred. But there's that kind of idea that maybe that gets at more what we're interested in when we're talking about films that are artistically a little bit more ambitious and aren't so hesitant to throw out kind of tried and true narrative structures and and this kind of thing. Maybe that's a category. I don't know.
So, because like an extension of my question is, are producers not quite as important in European cinema? Because I know that in the States and kind of in the studio system, the producer has sort of taken a lot of creative control because they're the one investing, right? I mean, is that problem taken out because there's more sort of national funding for these, or?
Oh, that's a bureaucracy in and of
Yeah,
itself,
it's a
though. I mean,
huge
that's
question.
that's an incredibly complicated question, and returns us to the national specificity. But not just national. This is an interesting phenomenon too. That more and more countries in Europe are actually delegating funding to regional sorts of things. So La Havre, for example, was funded by. Do you remember? It was the Normandy. Yeah, so the region in France actually has money to put towards these kind of projects. This happens in Utah too, right? That I mean, the counties in Utah, they give tax breaks, they give all kinds of incentives for films to come there because it's a huge economic boon. That's not national. That's something. That's another category that we could think of.
Well, they're wanting to show off their, a lot of these regions want to show off the
Yeah.
beauty of their region.
It's
and
tourism,
it's
attract
tourism.
people to come, yeah.
I mean, so, all the tourism that came to Sicily after Il Postino was just fantastic, and it even ruined the beach. That's another story. We got another question.
Do we have time for another question, or
I think so.
So you said that borders are porous, and
I said they're more porous.
they're getting more porous.
Some borders more than others.
But in the context of the European Union, the expanding European Union, with Bosnian and Hungarian and Romanian filmmakers who get funding, who never get funding from their own countries, don't you think that we can see a stronger nationalism precisely in these sort of small production movies? Because you've only mentioned like the big countries, big cultures, big funding, and a strong film tradition, such as France. But what do we do about more recent phenomena that we see now in the European Union? I mentioned Hungarian, Bosnian, Romanian, and others.
Well, I mean, let's take Romanian, just since I heard you speak about this not long ago, in a really interesting talk about the idea of the failed graft, right, and how this is thematized in so many Romanian films. But what really strikes me about, precisely as you're saying, it's dependent on outside funding. It's dependent on outside markets, too, to see it. And so, although there's this ostensible kind of nationalism, I mean, it's about national kinds of identity and issues and things like that, it's not... We can't talk about nationalism anymore in this kind of closed system kind of way, as if films are made in a completely unique way in this place. They don't go outside of this place. They're not influenced by things outside of this place. I mean, that only works with maybe North Korea, right? And Romania is not North Korea. Well, but no, it wasn't even then. It was so completely dominated by kind of Soviet, right? I mean, even then there was, So my point being that we need to get away from the idea of nationalism as this kind of absolute essentialist kind of discourse. It still has a place, clearly, but only if we can see the way that it interacts with these other kinds of discourses and other ways of seeing film, right? Film is a powerful one. It makes Benedict Anderson's argument about imagined communities really well, right? In that it's this mobile kind of medium that can spread a message or an idea or an image in this spectacular kind of way. But it's precisely its mobility that ultimately undermines the idea of the imagined community that Benedict Anderson is putting out there, because he's kind of imagining it as this closed system. And that's simply not the way that it ends up working, because it's always interacting with other films and funding and audiences and expectations that defy what can be limited to what we typically call a nation.
Mm-hmm. But I still think that it's interesting how for all these nations that I mentioned, film basically skips their own territory and goes direct to film festivals.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
But markets Romanianness at the same time, right?
Yes.
This
so
is the interesting
product,
thing.
Yeah, the
and this was
product
the
of
complaint
marketing.
that Swedes had with Bergman, is like, why does the world think that Sweden looks like a Bergman film? We don't even watch Bergman films, right?
Exactly,
And he was far more popular, at least until he died, outside of Sweden
Yeah.
than he ever was in Sweden. It's an interesting phenomenon. Never a prophet in your own country.
there's this movement series. I forget what it's called. It's a series, something movement. It's a series of films that are coming out. But I saw my first Slovenian film thanks to that, and it's even the Slovenian film is called Slovenka, which is about a Slovenian prostitute. Maybe this is a good point to stop on it. But there's the idea of European Union, that European businessmen are coming to give euros to spend time with her and everything, and the fact that it globalizes to the point that she's able to get out of that system. But
yeah, so because you have that a lot, and I think that it kind of coincides with the political nationalism that you see in some of these Eastern European countries, right?
Yeah.
So.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. This is a great discussion, but I know some of you are waiting to hear the winner of the student giveaway for this session. And the winner is, if she's still here, Nicole Berriman. You were the one who said you never win anything. All right, we want to thank our guests so much for this wonderful discussion, and we hope you will continue to stay around and ask them some questions as you go out and enjoy the wonderful food that we have out in the lobby. So thanks for coming.